Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Ethos Online. Again, this is a space where we can be, belong, and become the very best version of ourselves. So, wherever you're joining us, again, whether that's Florida, Arkansas, we had a couple hits from Arkansas a couple weeks ago, Colorado, California, wherever you are, we just want to say thank you for joining us and starting or continuing the conversation wherever you've joined us. We want to say thank you so much for supporting this. And so, a reminder, we are doing basically, this has been almost a year and a half long study over the book of Genesis. And so, we want to ask that share this. If you like what we've done here, if you find some of the interesting, like rabbinical or historical references, share these. I think the more that we can teach people that this book is actually really relevant once you understand the historical context, I think the whole thing pops. It really comes alive. And I think wherever you are in your faith, whether you have none or whether you feel like, man, I've never had more faith in my life, wherever you are in that spectrum, I think there's a space for everyone. Maybe you watch it just for the idea that I want to gain some historical education on this. I want to know more about the Jewish people. Awesome. Or if you're someone that says, I love the Bible, I think the divine shows up everywhere on its pages. And when I read this, man, the whole thing comes alive. I feel closer to my God. Awesome. Wherever you are with it, I think there's space for everyone. And so, again, welcome to Ethos. So, as a reminder, we are moving through the book of Genesis. We understand Genesis was not a book literally teaching us about historical facts, specific dates, how long someone lived, specific real names. That was never the point. Not to say some of those things are not real, but the idea here was not that they wrote a history book. The idea was that Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, what they called Torah, written by the Jewish people, this was compiled so that they would hold what it meant to be a Jew, right? They would essentially, in the middle of Babylonian captivity, they would not assimilate. And so this whole concept, it kept them safe from Babylonian values, from Babylonian gods, all those things. They kept Judaism kosher. And so Genesis, what you find as you read through the book, you're going to see the tribe of Israel showing up over and over and over again. And they show up not in a very obvious way for us readers thousands of years later. They show up in the stories. They show up in the characters. They show up in the themes, in the places, in the words that are Hebrew that we don't know anymore, that we have to research and study. They show up all over the place. But if you're not Jewish and you don't live way back then, sometimes you need to study it a little more to understand it. And so that's what we do here at Ethos. We take the time to study, to delve in, to understand the words, the implications. Rabbinical, these rabbis who basically years and years ago, thousands of years ago, centuries ago, they basically they were the ones that wrote. They were the ones that shared interpretations. And so that's why we go back and we say, what did they have to say to their specific audience about this book? And so that's what we do here in a nutshell. So anyways, let's delve into Genesis. It's been a couple weeks. We kind of got sidetracked a little bit, and my own life has been a little crazy, and I'll share a little bit more about that at the end. But here we go. We finished a couple weeks ago with the story of the cupbearer, right? And that dream that the cupbearer had. So today we're going to delve into the dream that the baker had, which has some interesting implications as well. Many that I would argue most of us in Christianity who have kind of grown up seeing this story read to us, this story has a very different meaning than it did when we read it years ago from a Christian perspective and not a Jewish one. So today we read chapter 40, 16 through 23. So again, reminder, this book about Joseph, this story, not literally about a kid named Joseph with a nice coat. The story of Israel is in the story of Joseph. It's about Israel. So here we go. Let's read. Verse 16 through 18 we'll start. Now the chief baker saw that he had interpreted well, referring to Joseph, right, about the cupbearer's dream. So he said to Joseph, me too. In my dream, behold, there were 3 wicker baskets on my head. And in the topmost basket were all kinds of Pharaoh's foods, the work of a baker, and the birds were eating them from the basket atop my head. And Joseph replied and said, "This is its meaning. The 3 baskets represent 3 days." Verse 19 and 20. "In another 3 days, Pharaoh will remove your head from you and hang you on the gallows, and the birds will eat your flesh off of you." Wow, right? Now it came about the 3rd day, Pharaoh's birthday, that Pharaoh made a feast for all of his servants, and he counted the chief cupbearer and the chief baker among his servants. And he restored the chief cupbearer to his position as cupbearer, and he placed the cup on Pharaoh's palm. And the chief baker he hanged, as Joseph had interpreted to them. But the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, and he forgot him. So, short verse, but interesting interpretations I'm going to share with you. So, again, reminder here, the baker. When we understand the baker here, the baker is charged with creating meals not only for royalty, right, but also for the worship of their gods. So the baker is in charge of the very important element of like divine worship, which was sometimes more held toward the Pharaoh, right? So the Pharaoh is God on earth. So whenever there was any kind of dinner he's preparing, it was not just like a, "Hey, good meal today, baker." It was, "You have pleased the gods today, baker." So imagine like if you overcook the steak, you are not just displeasing the people who are eating there. To them, you are displeasing all the gods. So how important is the baker position? It's actually extremely important. Really, really important, because food and worship in almost every civilization, it goes hand in hand, right? And so the baker position, really, really high position, right? It is right there connected to the actual priests of that culture, because you were highly involved in worship. So this is the baker, that's the position. And so regarding this one, the cupbearer, we again know that many rabbinical interpretations say that the cupbearer is there because there was a fly in the goblet, right? So with the baker, the funny kind of interesting tongue-in-cheek rabbinical interpretations thousands of years ago was that he was there because there was a pebble found in the bread, right? So it's kind of funny when you read a lot of these interpretations from essentially the people who are writing them. It's always kind of funny to see what some of their interpretations were. So here we go. Let's look at verse 16. "Now the chief baker saw that he had interpreted well." So this is a verse that oftentimes I think gets kind of brushed over. We don't really take time to think about this. But again, the tradition, there's the Jewish tradition that says this text, basically both individuals, the cupbearer and the baker, they dreamt both of these dreams. They both did. And so they understood the other person's dream. They understood. And so he knew Joseph basically had interpreted it because he already knew it. And so, of course, this is going to set up the story, right? It sets up the story. But again, we miss this perspective that both of them knew the dreams. And so once the baker hears the dream, he says, "Okay, this guy's legit." Notice again, the baker, he's the one that waits until he thinks it's safe, right? Again, I would argue this is kind of a setup. The cupbearer is the more virtuous one, whereas the baker kind of holds his cards tightly, right? Doesn't want to show his hand. And so this is often how most Jewish interpretations have it. They feel that the cupbearer is very virtuous, the baker is kind of crafty, cunning. He is the one that has something to hide, right? That's not as virtuous. And so this is kind of, again, if you know the Hebrew and you understand the words and implications of those words, this is kind of how they have the setup of these two characters. So here we go. Interesting perspective here that I thought was really fascinating. Here's what one rabbi says. Its midrashic meaning is that each dreamed both dreams. So again, meaning that each dreamed his own dream. That is the meaning of what is stated in verse 16. So again, very common understanding. It's not just Tony telling you this. It's actually how the rabbis viewed it. So here we go. Moving along. He said to Joseph, "Me too. In the dream, behold, there were the 3 wicker baskets on my head." So this is kind of an interesting twist here on the 2 dreams. The cupbearer, watch this now. If any of you are connected with how to read literature, you'll catch this. The cupbearer, he kind of witnesses the events of his dream within his own body. So as he's doing things, he's kind of seen it from his point of view, right? If you were writing the story, you'd be seeing your hands moving. You would be seeing everything through your eyes, right? That was the perspective of the cupbearer's dream. However, it's interesting when you look at the baker. The baker witnesses everything as if he's watching someone else. And that's a fascinating one. And so look at what this one rabbi has to say about this. This shift in point of view is common in Jewish writing. The cupbearer's dream is a redemptive one. He is experiencing the dream and aware of life around him, while the baker is a third person perspective that is almost always associated with death. That comes from Rabbi Yaakov Brown, and he's kind of an interesting, more modern day scholar. But basically, for Jewish writers, what he's saying is here, it's some foreshadowing. They're giving you in foreshadowing. This man's story, he's seen everything from third person. It's not going to end well, right? This person is going to experience death, right? When you see it from a first person perspective, there's almost always some kind of redemptive element. When you see it from the third person perspective, there's always going to be some kind of trial, tribulation, painful moment, how it ends, right? So again, fascinating stuff in Jewish lore, how they wrote. The cupbearer represents, watch this now, the cupbearer represents Israel experiencing rebirth during captivity. So that's a fascinating perspective as well. The cupbearer and the baker, they're not just two individuals who show up in the story, they actually represent something. And so as a Jewish person, you'd understand the baker here, if the cupbearer is something positive, a redemptive story, then the baker represents Israel when they've lost their story. That's fascinating to me. So again, the man's story, not going to end well, right? It's not going to end well for Israel when you forget your story. And we'll get back to that in a minute. Verse 17. And in the topmost basket were all kinds of Pharaoh's foods, the work of a baker, and the birds were eating them from the basket atop my head. So there's a word here. The word is oph for that the birds. So the word is oph. It actually meant like a flying creature. And so if you actually look through some of the old drawings and visuals of this, you don't always see birds. Sometimes they'll be like flying serpents or those kind of things. It actually simply means a flying creature. It could have been anything, right? But this flying creature goes over and it feeds on all of the bread. And so this is kind of a reference to some kind of creature that's going to feed on the flesh of corpses. It's the same verse that's used, the same word in 1 Kings 14:11 and 16:4, where basically these beasts fly over, and anyone that was essentially like doing bad in the world, these flying creatures went over and just devoured their dead carcasses. Anyone that went against God, right? And so this word here, most Jewish people immediately connected. Oh man, this baker's cursed, right? If these flying creatures are going over his head, that means he has been living a cursed life. He's done something that deserves death, right? And so these flying creatures will go over his head. So again, interesting when you can kind of put together these pieces. Notice this, the fact that the birds are eating Pharaoh's baked goods without fear shows that the baker is absent. That one, again, the baker basically has this. The baker has a job, and yet he's absent from that. So understand this, the baker has work to do, something he's supposed to be doing, and yet he forgets his purpose. And so deep at the heart of what the baker represents is this idea that this baker, this individual, has lost their purpose. And because they've lost their purpose, they actually become a curse to the people they serve. Yeah, some of you are already putting the connection together, right? Israel is the baker sometimes. Israel's sometimes the cupbearer. What happens to Israel when they lose their purpose? That's the question, right? And so this is such an interesting perspective. Again, the baker, Israel. What happens when we forget our purpose? What happens when we forget our story? We become a curse to everyone around us, especially those we're supposed to serve. Yeah. I think about churches sometimes. I have been in so many different churches, and I think about different organizations, even non-religious, when they forget their purpose, and maybe they just want to make money all of a sudden, or whatever the thing is, when they forget their first purpose, they become an absolute curse to the people they originally thought they would help. And that's why we hear stories about, like, hey, this soup kitchen went awry because so and so decided to take all the money for themselves. This organization that was supposed to be about social justice decided they were going to do this and this and this, and everything falls apart. You actually, when you forget your purpose, when you don't know a mission, if you don't start something with a mission or a purpose or a vision statement, if you just start willy-nilly, whatever it is, the whole thing falls apart. And so Israel, this is a call for Israel. What is your purpose? Have you forgotten your purpose? Have you forgotten your vision? Because if you did, the whole thing's going to crumble. You will become a curse to the people you're supposed to serve. Right? This whole vision is such an interesting one. It really does pop. So verse 18, notice this. So Joseph, he replies to him and he says, look, this is the meaning. I know it. God's given it to me, right? The 3 baskets represent 3 days. The 3 baskets represent 3 days. So the similarities with the cupbearer's dream, they kind of end here with these 3. So 3 days typically brings this idea of a resurrection, right? Which is really what's happening to both of these individuals. So after these 3 days, that's where similarities stop altogether. But the idea here is there's a resurrection, right? The cupbearer is resurrected from the belly of prison, right? And he, after this death experience in prison, pops up, he experiences life, right? He remembers his purpose, he serves well. The problem here, though, with our friend the baker is he forgets his purpose when he's resurrected. Again, this idea of judgment. When he is out of prison, he loses his life. Again, one might even say eternally, right? The two experience something very different. And so this idea of 3 days resurrection, 3 days and something happens. The question is, after 3 days, is there life or is there death? 3 days. Is Jonah going to experience life, or is he going to stay at the bottom of the pit, right? The bottom of the ocean? What will happen 3 days? 3 days is a marker. There's something's going to happen, right? There's either death or there's full, complete life again. What will happen here? For the baker, it's death. For the cupbearer, it's resurrection into life. For Israel, what will you choose? Your story hasn't ended, right? In verse 19, in another 3 days, Pharaoh will remove your head from you and hang you on a gallows, and the birds will eat your flesh off of you. So again, the repetition of 3 days, indication, this idea that God's hand is on events. It's going to convey like a sense of completion, resurrection. But here's something interesting historically. I went down the rabbit hole. I just started looking into gallows. What did the Egyptian gallows look like? And as I studied this, I was like, oh man, like this is heavy. I didn't know this. I knew that the Assyrians did something similar, but I had no idea. And there's a connection here to first century Romans and the first century Jews during Jesus' time. So notice this. Look at this slide with me. There's this actual picture, these depictions of what would happen to people when they're on the gallows. So notice this. There is, of course, a correlation with the hanging on a tree of the curse in Deuteronomy 21:23 and the crucifixion of the Messiah, who is the bread of life, according to John. So when considering the baker's dream, one brings life while the other brings death. So there is this interesting moment in history where the Egyptians basically, they practiced an execution method where the body of a victim is impaled, and you can kind of see on this picture, impaled on this long spike stave, basically. And it's lifted into this position outside those city walls. And so it was basically a tree stump that had a big spike on it. And as someone went into the city, they would see all of these people who essentially were enemies of the state. And it was a warning to anyone going into that city, we don't put up with riffraff of anyone going against Egypt, against Rome, against whatever. So this is probably the means of the baker's coming execution, actually. And so really interesting to me that Rome When Rome sees this, Rome borrowed from everybody, right? Rome is basically a hodgepodge of all the great empires before them. And so what they did is they took this method of impaling someone up through their chest cavity and up through right up through the jaw and out through the forehead. What they did is they saw that and they said, people die far too quickly that method. So they took this method and they found a way to keep the person alive a little bit longer. And you know the story of Jesus. And so, again, it's a fascinating one where you learn Rome is actually really, really horrific. They took some of these methods and they just made it worse and worse and worse. But this is the ending for the baker. One historian said this: when Israel brings life to its captors, there's redemption, right? When Israel forgets its values and assimilates, they experience death and curses. They experience brokenness. They get the baker's end, right? And so it's really interesting too when you think about Jesus. Jesus says, I am the substitute for you. I will take on that ending so that you don't have to anymore. You don't have to keep repeating that same cycle. Let me show you what that cycle looks like, right? That cycle of violence, of forgetting your story. I remember the story. I am the story. Visualize in front of you. Let me take on that ending for you. And let me remind you what the baker's end looks like, right? Let me remind you that this is not the direction we want to be going. This is what happens when you head that direction. Someone innocent dies, right? And so, again, really fascinating. You can see these connections all throughout Scripture. Let me keep going. Verse 20. Now it came about on the third day, Pharaoh's birthday, that Pharaoh made a feast for all his servants. And he counted the chief cupbearer and the chief baker among his servants. So, really common celebration. Pharaoh's birthday was a high festival day in Egypt. And so it was kind of like a hands on deck day. Everyone's hands on. These gifts were given. Basically, on that day, Pharaoh would give out tons of blessings, but he would also give out curses. And so it was very common on that day to basically for the Pharaoh to say, you know what? I don't like you. You've messed up a lot this year. And he would have those people hung in front of people. And then he'd say, you know what, cupbearer, you've done awesome things this year, actually. Come up forward. Let me bless you with gifts on my birthday. This is something that people either looked forward to or were terrified of on that special day. The Romans, notice this, the Romans were not the first to introduce the sentencing and release of prisoners during royal birthday celebrations. Right? We see this practice first in the Assyrians and the Egyptians. So again, give me Barabbas, right? Not a new idea. This was something very common in many empires throughout history. Verse 21. And he restored the chief cupbearer to his position as cupbearer, and he placed the cup on Pharaoh's palm. This was an action of basically saying, you are restored. You are back on. You're my right hand man. That was the idea here. That kind of idea. So the cupbearer, the one remembering his story, his values, he is reinstated. He experiences freedom. So keep that one in mind. The cupbearer does the good thing. He remembers. He keeps his values. When he is resurrected out of the prison, he experiences life. He can serve and bring life to everyone around him, even the people who wanted to kill him, right? But then to the baker. And the chief baker he hanged, as Joseph had interpreted to them. So the baker, the one that forgets his story, his values, he's given death. He experiences captivity, right? And you can kind of already see any Jewish person reading this during that era, anyone telling the story, they're putting themselves in the story. They recognize we are Israel as cupbearer or baker. Which one will you choose? And so this is why over and over again, when you read rabbinical interpretations, it always places Israel in either one, depending on where they are historically at that point. Really fascinating. So notice this, verse 23. And the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, and he forgot him. So just to reiterate the point, he forgets. Right? This cupbearer, he was supposed to do the good thing, supposed to bring Joseph out of captivity. Unfortunately, Joseph is still there. Because why? because the cupbearer forgot to tell, right? This idea of forgetfulness is a theme you're going to see throughout that story. If you choose to read it again in chapter 40, it's all about, will Israel remember or will they forget? Right? Will they choose to be the one that forgets or remembers? And this is why Rabbi Malachi Souza, he says this: the cupbearer forgets the messianic one, forgets the message, forgets the direction home, and is lost. He's lost. So this sense of home, again, it's one of the most common themes in Israel's writings. Home. How do we get back home? Right? Many people will say, well, Jesus' main message was that he came to save us and free us from our sins and hung on the cross. That was never the message of Jesus. I'm sorry, that was not the main point of Jesus. Never was. The main point of Jesus was the kingdom of heaven. And you could say there, instead of kingdom of heaven, it's synonymous with the word home. How do we get back home? Not someplace up there away, but home. How do we experience shalom right here, right now? Whether we're in captivity or whether we're back to a place where we're the empire on top, right? How do we experience home? Whether it's here in our hearts or physically right here, how do we get back home? That's the concept. And so real rebirth, that happens once we take time to remember home. Once we take time, it's then that we can kind of recalibrate, we can realign. Home becomes our compass. And so for me, as I read the Bible, I'm no longer thinking of it as some future prediction or it's all about this figure, that figure. What I see over and over again is a tribe of people who are saying this: how do we find home again? Because we keep getting sidetracked. We keep getting devoured by all these empires. How do we get back home? We just want to get back home. And it reminded me this week, I was sitting there with a friend at the park, and our kids were mountain biking. And my friend and I, we found out we have something in common. We both lived in Michigan. I grew up there. He went there and did his fellowship there. And so we're talking about Michigan. We're talking about the weather, right? We're talking about whether I'm a Michigan State fan or a Wolverine fan. We're talking about all of this. We're talking about the winters. We're talking about driving. We're talking about the beaches, all of these things. And that led to other things until we're talking about the religious tribes that we were in, right? And it's funny, we had all these connections. And as we're talking, it's interesting that these funny moments started to come up. Do you remember, hey, in Michigan, we had potlucks, or we said soda or pop or whatever the words were. We said these things and we just found ourselves laughing because we started talking about home. And home has a lot of funny moments, doesn't it? A lot of beautiful moments, a lot of painful moments. Remembering home, though, when we talked about home, it created the sense of gratitude for both of us. It created a sense of gratitude, a sense of purpose, maybe, or even identity, right? I don't have any intention, desire to live in Michigan again. However, when I think about Michigan, and I tell stories about Michigan and those summers in Michigan and mosquitoes as big as birds, right? I have to laugh about it. It brings a sense of identity, purpose. It does all of those things. It realigns us. And so as we're talking, I thought, man, this is such a brilliant time for me to hear this. My family, I was telling you in the beginning, we have been through some really terrible things the last couple of weeks. My wife lost her father. Our son was born super early, prematurely, a lot of complications. And then we ended up back in the hospital, all this blood work, transfusions, all of these things. And we were feeling so discouraged. But there was something over and over again that reminded us of home. We thought about home. We thought about Danielle and Ender, our new one, coming here. And we thought about what it'll look like. And that sense of home, that hope for home, kept us going over and over. And there were nights where Brooklyn would cry for her mom, who'd been in the hospital already for 5 days straight. And yet that hope for home kept us going, that we will experience home again at some point in time. Mom and Ender are going to be here and we'll experience home. There's another moment my oldest daughter and I, we were sitting in the car, and she just needed to get out, right? We were stuck in the house. She said, Dad, can we just go get ice cream or something? I was like, sure, absolutely. So just her and I, we went out, and we got home, and she said, do we have to go in yet? I said, no, let's hang out. So we sat there eating our blizzards, super healthy, and we started talking about how difficult things were and how frustrating it was. And she said, where's God in all of this? And there was so many interesting, beautiful conversations we had. But at one point, she says to me, she said, I know we'll get through it. I know we'll get through it. We're Werfels. She said, we're Werfels. And my heart melted. I just had to smile at that. We're Werfels. Here's the thing. My daughter recognized part of our DNA as a family is resilience. And I say that to my kids a lot. Hey, we're Werfels, right? I want them to take pride in Werfel, even though Werfel, my whole life, it was kind of my last name was always Tease, Waffle, whatever. But I want my kids to know to be a Werfel, it means you're resilient. You're tough. You can make it through difficult times. When my daughter said it, I had to smile. You're right. We're Werfels, right? And that is exactly what happens in the Joseph narrative, right? Joseph says, hey, we're Israelites. Don't forget that. We are resilient people. We feel called by the divine to be here. We feel like we have a gift that we can share with the world, right? Home is a beautiful place where everyone should be invited, right? That we're Israelites. That's what the story is. Israel's reminding its people, when we remember who we make it through. We are resilient. We're Werfels, right? What a brilliant, brilliant story. And I love looking at this story through that context. The whole thing, again, it just brings it alive for me. It makes sense. So I hope you enjoyed this study over these two dreams. Next week, we're going to delve into chapter 41. But before we do, how do we take it home today? How do we show some relevance after we've done the difficult work? So here's what I thought. How do we build some resilience? Sandra Corelli, I found this really cool article, and I thought I want to share this with you. Sandra Corelli brings up some really interesting points about how to build resilience, how to be like Israel, how to remember your story. So here's a couple things to practice this week. Try it out, see if it works. Again, I give these because for me, I try really hard all throughout the week to try to put these into practice. I actually put these on my phone, and I'll just go through them throughout the week and remind myself in the morning. Let's try this out. If it works, awesome. If it doesn't, it was worth a try. So, number one, she says to build resilience is practice thought awareness. And I know that sounds very mystical, but here's what she says. Resilient people don't let negative thoughts derail their efforts. Interesting, right? Instead, they consistently practice positive thinking. This means listening to how you talk to yourself when something goes wrong, right? I'm an idiot. I hate my life. Why do I do such stupid things? You stop this negative self-talk, right? If you find yourself making statements that are permanent, passive, personified, correct those thoughts in your mind, right? I'm not an idiot, right? I'm very intelligent. I'm not stupid. I don't always do things wrong, right? Stop, practice awareness of where your thoughts are going. It's a great idea. Number two, edit your outlook. So this is like practice cognitive restructuring, right? So change the way you think about negative situations, bad events. This is not the end of the world, right? Have I ever faced anything like this before? Asking questions like that is going to minimize the tension, the drama, all of it. Edit the outlook. This is not the worst thing in the world, right? It could be worse. It could be worse. Number three, learn from mistakes. Yeah, easier said than done, right? But here's what she says. Every mistake has the power to teach you something important. So look for the life lesson. And this one, I feel like hindsight is always 2020, right? It's always easy to do later on. But if in the moment we can think for just a second or a fraction of a second, is there a lesson that may come out of this? Just even that alone, asking that question may give me some hope for that 2020 moment, right? That hindsight moment. Number four, choose your response. Remember, we all experience bad days. We all go through shared crises, right? We experience this, but we have a choice how we respond, right? I can get really mad. I can get panicked. I can be super negative, or I can be logical, right? I can act in calm, take control, find solution. You can choose how you react, right? You have a choice in the matter. You don't have to choose the panic button every time. You can say, I'm going to breathe this time. I'm going to calm down. I'm going to take a moment and I'm just going to deal with it. You can choose how you respond. You always have that choice. And then lastly, I like this one. She says, maintain perspective. She says this, remember, we all experience bad days. Resilient people understand that. Although a situation or crisis may seem overwhelming at the moment, it may not take that much of an impact over the long term. So try to avoid blowing events out of proportion. We all go through crises at some point, but we have a choice how we respond. We can we can choose to slow down, move through, or we can freak out. So maintain a good perspective on the thing, right? Maintain that perspective. See it all the way through. Everyone, I hope you enjoyed this. I love everything we do in these studies. Again, we do so much heavy work and then we apply it. In my opinion, this is gold. This is so much fun. So if you've been following us, please consider going to ethos-church.org/donate. We are a tax-deductible organization. So consider donating. It keeps us going. We do a lot to get these things prepared. We've got Leo over there doing a lot of editing. We move through setup, all of these different things. There's hours of study that go into this every week. So please consider donating and share these videos. Make sure to share them. And if you want to do live conversations, please email me. Let's keep that going. Ethos Living Rooms, so much fun. People from all over the country together, having great conversations. And always hit that subscribe button. Share these videos. We are going to have over almost 2 years worth of awesome material over the book of Genesis. And so please consider sharing it. This stuff is good. I'm so proud to be able to say we went through Genesis and we took it responsibly. Everyone, I love you. I'll see you next week as we delve into chapter 41. So I'll see you later. Love you.